Welcome everyone officially. We are very happy to be here tonight with Joan to talk about the evolution of a neighborhood, NoHo, in her book. We'll be sharing links where how you can purchase the book, and then also some links about village preservation. Hi, I see someone from Chicago. Thanks for joining us from so far. We're so glad to give you insight into our neighborhood. So we are Village Preservation. If you don't know us, welcome. We are a nonprofit organization, and we are in existence to support the preservation of the history of the village, East Village and NoHo, to celebrate the cultural significance, as well as to work to make sure that the built environment kind of remains cohesive for our neighborhood and serves the needs of our community. So we're here tonight. I'll share some information about how to get to know village preservation in the chat. But I don't want to take too long away because Joan has a great presentation for us. So I'm going to introduce Joan right now, who first studied painting and interior design at the Fashion Institute of Technology, FIT, and received her MA in art education from New Paltz State University. After completing her studies, Joan moved to Manhattan to begin her professional career as an artist educator. During the 60s, she taught art at various public school programs and began exhibiting her portfolio in galleries in and around New York City. Living and working in New York City had a very strong influence on her paintings, where landscapes and architecture became very important subjects, and we'll get to see some of that tonight, which is exciting. In the 70s, she started teaching drawing at Lehman College in the Bronx. That's quite a trek, Joan, to go up to Lehman from down here. And at Kean College in New Jersey. To support her artistic practice, she became a freelance architectural and interior renderer, which you'll hear her speak about that a little bit. And Joan is currently a professor of interior design at the Fashion Institute of Technology. And I'm so pleased to have Joan here with us. You can feel free to put in questions in the Q&A pane in the chat. I will field those with Joan later on, but first I'm going to turn it over to her for her presentation. Thank you for being here, Joan.
Thank you very much, Leanne, and I welcome everybody. This is an interesting new format for me, other than I have taught this way, but not in a lecture format. I'll jump right in and talk about the the book, which is The Evolution of a Neighborhood, NoHo. And I chose the neighborhood because this is where I live. And initially, I started this endeavor based on my curiosity. And you know what they say about curiosity. Well, this opened Pandora's box. My curiosity was basically, what did NoHo look like when it was in its earliest days as a farm? And I discovered many interesting facts about the neighborhood, which I will talk about as we go on. Unfortunately, I don't have any drawings of downtown farmland, but this was basically Midtown, somewhere around the area of Bloomingdale's. And this was basically why it was called Bloomingdale's, because it was a blooming area of farmland and fields. The Valentine's Manual, which was one of my major reference points, was a diary of the city council meetings that went on. And this was continued till the end of the 1800s. But the manual contained not only written minutes, but drawings. And it was these drawings that I was able to access at the public library to get some feel for what this area looked like after the Dutch took away so much of New York City from the Native Americans. And I won't try to keep this apolitical. Sometimes I can't help myself, but at any rate, one of the things we'll notice as we go through the lecture is Broadway went all the way up to Albany, but it was purely a dirt road for much of it. And you will find in some of the drawings, as I mentioned earlier about Bloomingdale's, areas that were called, for instance, Canal Street. Canal Street basically was a canal and then became a street. So many of the names that we have in the city, like all over this country and in England in particular, where English was the language, names really related to particular areas. So this is a drawing, again, from the New York Historical Society of what Canal Street initially looked like. As I started to research my book, I spent a lot of time down at the New York archives where I found the deeds for Manhattan going back as far as the early settlers. And it was these deeds that allowed me to start to build plans, because plans didn't really exist until, but detailed plans, I should say, until fire plans were built, fire insurance came about, which was in the mid 1800s. Again, the image I'm showing you right now is a drawing of a hotel. It also allowed me to have a sense of what the architecture looked like in the early days, the early 17 to early 1800s. And a lot of that, of course, was Dutch influenced. I'm jumping a little bit, but I hope you'll follow. The deeds gave me the opportunity to get a sense of who lived where. And this is a map of the Herring farm, and Herring was a big family that owned a good deal of property. And you can see by the image here, all of the land that was part of the farm. This is the area that I outlined in black, which is making up the NoHo area. So you can get a sense of how much property this family owned. The city bought back a lot of the property, but the area down here in the early part of the time was bought by John Jacob Astor when he came over. As I mentioned, the archives allowed me to find out who was living, and you can see all of these little blocks here telling me who lived where and to give me some sense of scale of the layout for each of the buildings. It was that scale that allowed me to bring in, again, another sketch of one of the Midtown areas. This is 59th Street, Bloomingdale's. Going back for a moment to the scale and plans, from my experience as a freelance renderer who works primarily from plans and elevations to build perspectives, I was able to rebuild or build NoHo. I took the plans from the deeds, and I was able to then create elevations from those plans. Let's see what we have here. You can get a sense here, all of these rectangles made up different homes. This was a map that came out of the 1850s. As I said earlier, your insurance maps didn't really become real until the 50s, the 1850s. The area over here was originally an amusement park and gardens. It was called the Vauxhall Gardens, based on the English gardens. And in the early 17 or 1800s, gardens were a place for socializing in the summertime. Theaters had outdoor theater. People would stroll through these gardens. There was a beer garden. So it became the social venue for the people in the neighborhood. When Astor moved to New York, he bought up that big property right around here, and he settled in a house right here and built his library here. He opened up what is now Lafayette Street. It was originally called Lafayette Place. It ended here. It was a cul-de-sac. Art Place was the original name. It was here that the neighborhood, or it developed into a neighborhood, a very elegant, wealthy neighborhood by the standards of the time. And it was Astor who led the group, the social group, in terms of developing this neighborhood as a place to live. Astor, as many of you know, made his money initially from real estate, fur trade, and drug trade. He was actually quite a big drug dealer in East Asia, and that was where he started selling opium, which one doesn't really associate with him, but this was how he made a good deal of his money. He built his library here. You know, he was kind of a mixed message personage. He did a lot for the city, for the country, but he also did a lot of bad things. He had 8 children, which was rather normal at the time to build up families because children died at birth. And there was a great deal of family responsibility and attention that was necessary to develop trade and their commerce, their wealth. Sorry, I'm going a little off track here for a moment. He cut back the gardens to just this particular area. He built a house across the street, which was for his daughter. He lived in this area here. The library was here. His daughter's house was here. And I'll show you some drawings of that in a moment. Just to go back to Mr. Astor. Sorry, my mouse is very active. He developed this neighborhood, as I mentioned earlier, to become this very elegant social neighborhood. The elevation can give you a better idea of what the neighborhood looked like at that time. These were the gardens, the Vauxhall Gardens. This was a library. The scale on this is a little off because I extended it, so it's a little wider than it is taller. It should be taller. Sorry. Mouse, stop. His home was here. And again, at that time, it was considered a mansion, but relative to today's value system, it was very modest. The whole block up to 4th Street was composed of different private homes. There was a church on the far right corner of Great Jones. Excuse me. Which was an Episcopalian church. And it was St. Bartholomew. It was the first place St. Bartholomew existed. And I'll go into that a little bit more later. The whole block consisted of these mansions. 4th Street is here. Great Jones Street was over here. This is what the block looks like today. So you have the Guathany building here, that glass tower on the corner of Astor Place. You have the extension of the public theater, which was the library in here. And of course, the rest of the buildings had been raised to make way for factories, which we'll discuss later on. As I mentioned earlier, this was a cul-de-sac for a long time, and then it became open. Lafayette Street was known as Lafayette Place. It was on Great Jones Street where there were many stables that serviced the homes on Lafayette Place. So the carriages, the horses, the all of the carriage people lived above their stables. So Great Jones was sort of not quite on the east side, a very luxurious street. It was actually quite funky, I think, with all the horses back and forth. This was the library that Astor built for himself, but it became a public library for the public as a reference library only. It wasn't until the mid-1800s that it became a lending library. But the interior was something that was quite extraordinary. Even to this day, if you're familiar with the public theater, you'll see some of those skylights still exist. As you can see, the house here is Astor's private home, and again, rather modest compared to today's scale and design in the architecture. The house next door was a family named Sands, and I won't go into the occupants of all of the buildings. That would take a little more time. Just a detail of that interior. I'm going to sort of zigzag up Lafayette Street and try to take you on this tour. I have blocked out this side, which is the west side of Lafayette Place, and that housed what was called the Colonnade Row or La Grange. And these houses or apartments, there were 9 of them. This is the original Colonnade Row or La Grange. And there were 9 apartments, and each one contained 26 rooms. The thing about this building was that it was based on Greek architecture and Corinthian columns. The gardens on the right side were next to the house that John Jacob built for his daughter called Langdon House. So you can get a sense, I hope, of the richness of this neighborhood based on the elevation. This was a Dutch Reformed church. So we have a church, a Protestant church on one side of the street, diagonally across on Great Jones is the Episcopalian. And they service this neighborhood predominantly. As the neighborhood changed about 20, 30 years, both the Episcopalian church moved uptown to St. Bart's up to Park Avenue. And eventually the Dutch Reformed Church was raised in the late 1800s, as were some of these buildings. Half of the colonnades remains today. It was partially removed because of, there you go, because as commerce developed in the area, Wanamaker's took over this space, destroyed part of the colonnades, and built their department store. The building on the far corner of Astor Place replaced the Langdon House, which only lasted, the Langdon House only lasted for about 20 years. She rarely lived in it. She preferred to be in Europe. This is a drawing that I found in the public library, I believe it was there, of what the colonnades actually look like. And again, we don't have photography until it's really developed for commercial use until the 50s, the 1850s. So one really depended upon drawings to tell stories. And those stories, those drawings became the vehicle for my research. I was able to gather out of this image the garden over here. I was able to see that this area here originally was garden or more woods at that point. This is a rendering that I did of looking south. Here is the Dutch Reformed Church, the colonnades, the Langdon House, and a house actually that was built not too long after the colonnades that replaced this garden over here. The garden here was also replaced by this structure. And this, again, was the house that Astor built for his daughter. Again, you can get a sense of how modest the architecture is, very utilitarian. The gardens on the left side. And we're looking on the right to Art Street, which is now Astor Place. This is what replaced this building and everything next door. Astor Liquors originally was here and then eventually moved uptown. Sorry, not uptown, to 4th Street downtown. But you can see here, this building here, I'm sorry, right here was where Wanamaker's was. It now houses NYU. NYU owns a lot of the property in this area. A tiny sliver, half of the colonnades exist today. As we move south, we move to 4th Street. And this is where the Dutch Reformed Church is, or was, sorry. We have over here the Merchant House Museum. That was originally settled we'll move there in a moment, but this gives you a sense of what the church, the Dutch Reformed Church, looked like in elevation and the gardens, woods behind it. Today, on Lafayette and 4th Street, we have a loft building and La Colombe Coffee downstairs. We have the De Vries building on the corner. Sorry, that's the wrong building. Excuse me. This is on 4th Street and Broadway. This was not the De Vries. The use of terracotta tile became very popular for the construction of many of these new buildings in the late 1800s based on Renaissance and Romanesque architecture. And it became a very stylish mode and material to be used. All right, this is another view of the Dutch Reformed Church, and we're looking north to Astor Place on Lafayette. And you can see some of these houses or mansions developed. We now travel to the east side of 4th Street. And the Merchant House Museum is here. It has a sister that's no longer, sorry, Merchant House is here, the sister is no longer. This was federal style architecture. There was another structure over here. One building still exists. There is now a pocket garden that is being built where this structure is. You can see this down here. There has been a battle going on for quite a long time. I believe it's almost 10 years. This is a garage that is owned by someone who owns another parking garage on Lafayette. They want to remove this garage and build a hotel here. The thing about the Merchant Museum is the fact that it is a totally intact, it's probably the only building in New York City that remains intact with its furniture and all of the plaster detailing on the interior. So it remained in the same family for several years, and it was originally the family of Treadwell, where he bought this building for $18,000. His family, he had some 8 children, 7 children, one died, and servants living in it. It's a federal style design. It has a beautiful garden in the back. The problem with this garage is when it is raised, if it will be, hopefully not, that it would destroy the interior of that building. And this is the building. This is the building. And this is the building right here. The second building, the sister, is the one that had been raised. The interiors have amazing plaster work. If you've never been to the museum, I suggest you take a trip. It's really quite worth your while. It gives you a sense of what that period was like. It's quite amazingly beautiful. The furnishings are still the original furniture. As I mentioned, the detail work on the interior. So the problem is that removing this structure will have a very horrible impact on the interior of the museum. And they want to put up 12-story, I think it went back to 10-story hotel. Anyway, there's been a lot of meetings going on over the years to try to prevent this from happening, and it's still in court. This is the DeVries building, which was a printing building, printing presses. It came about in the late 1800s. It now houses on the ground floor Astor Liquors. It's a beautiful space. The building itself is quite dynamic in its details. This is the corner, and this is the side elevation of the structure that is on Lafayette Place. This again is the rendering of 4th Street looking at the Dutch Reformed Church. And to give you a sense of what that block looked like in its early days, the early 1800s. This was a drawing that again gave me information about the detailing and the fact that there was a structure next door that was much taller. I get a bit of the sister next to this. I could not find any information about this particular plot of land, which is on 4th Street on the southwest corner street. So I just assumed that it was gardens or woods. The buildings behind are the buildings on Great Jones Street. Today, the structure here is called the Silk Building. This building houses offices and private residences. Keith Richards lived in this building at one point. Cher lived in this building at one point. There were a lot of notable people living in the neighborhood very quietly. And I'll talk more about that as we go to Great Jones Street. Broadway is here and Lafayette is over here. This is the southeast side of 4th Street. Again, these were private homes, gardens, wooded gardens. And today we have NYU owning this building now. There is a structure here which is of the same time, which has been restored and quite beautiful. The old Bowery Bar restaurant used to be here. This is when it was there. There is now a new co-op office building going up on that corner, probably about 12 stories. The area that I just showed you, this is a little open area that, let me go back 1 second. Right in here, I didn't put it in, but the chapel for the orphanage, which I'll show you in a moment, that was on the corner of Great Jones and Lafayette. It was also Robert Rauschenberg, who lived in this building, had his studio in this chapel. We'll talk about that in a moment as well. This is the original St. Bartholomew Church. This is Great Jones Street looking east to the Bowery. And as I mentioned earlier, we have many stables on this side of the street. And I found very little information visually of what was going on beyond. I had pictures, drawings, I should say, of the church, and that gave me some information about some of the structures next to it, but not any further. This was Rauschenberg's building. He bought this and has been restored several times. Robert Rauschenberg, the painter, which was replaced, that corner, the church, St. Bartholomew, was raised as the neighborhood changed. And let me just get back to that for a moment. Lafayette Place existed for probably about 30, 40 years. As the society, the social society of the Astors became wealthier, there was a desire to, of course, express that wealth. And so they moved uptown. And if any of you have been watching The Gilded Age, you'll get a better sense of what those homes look like. They moved up to Fifth Avenue into the 70s and built these massive mansions up there. And what happened was there were several things going on at the same time. The wealth increased because commerce increased. The Industrial Revolution began in the late 1800s, and that drove the commerce to become very strong in New York City. There were several other dynamics that were going on at the same time, but that was the main focus of what drove many of the families from this neighborhood uptown. As that happened, the whole area changed. Workers, craftsmen developed shops on Great Jones Street in this area. You'll see the development of lofts to house factories. And we have here which is the corner. I'll go back one more time because I'm blows me away sometimes, is an orphanage. This orphanage was considered the mission of the Immaculate Virgin, but the irony is that it became St. Joseph's Home for boys. There is a place, and I grew up on Staten Island, called the Mount Loretta. And Mount Loretta was the continuation of this orphanage that eventually it moved to Staten Island and became Mount Loretta. So it went through its own evolution from St. Joseph's Home to Staten Island to Mount Loretta. The building next door was part of the orphanage at that point. There is, and you can see a very small bit of it, a chapel back here, which was initially on 4th Street, right in here. So the chapel was built as part of the orphanage. And that chapel became the studio for Robert Rauschenberg. He had this whole building, which is this building here. The orphanage was raised and it became a gas station, and that existed in the late 60s into the early 70s, and then it became a parking lot, which I guess is quite economically sound. But there are talks now of this becoming developed into a residence of some 12 stories, depending on the administration today. All right, we're traveling now to Great Jones Street, and this is the northwest corner or street. In its early days, it was a very elegant block. Again, the stables were here, but there were private residences here. Great Jones Street ran from Broadway across to the Bowery. It wasn't until the early 1900s that it was broken away, and we'll talk about that in a moment, when the subway was built. So that was the number, as we know it today, the number 6 line, the 5 and 6. Again, I'll talk about that in a moment. The corner building was owned by the Schrimmelhorn family. And initially it was their private mansion. They moved uptown very quickly. It became Columbia's law school. And that existed for some 30 years. That then became the Schrimmelhorn building, which exists today and is quite an extraordinarily designed building of the Romanesque Renaissance period. Again, the terracotta is very common here. It was designed by Hardenberg, who also did, the Dakota. Today, Lafayette Cafe is on the ground floor. It has gone through many different restaurants of the same ownership. Prior to that, it was a factory that manufactured yarn. Again, this gave me a sense of what was on this corner. This is Great Jones Street here and Lafayette over here. This is an elevation of that block. Broadway is here and Lafayette here. And this is the Schrimmerhorn building. This building housed on the ground floor a bank in its early days. This building, I don't know the exact date on that, but it's been there for quite a long time. I believe it was probably there from the early 1840s. You can see in this plan the northeast side of Great Jones Street. And again, I found very little information in terms of what the buildings look like. So I took artistic liberty and designed them myself. This is the side elevation of St. Bartholomew and the stables. So this information I found in my research by looking at drawings of St. Barth and finding that there was a stable there and a building, a home next, right behind it. The rest of this is based on plans. And as I said, I developed the elevation. So there was some artistic license on my part in reconstructing the neighborhood. This is as it is today, the beautiful firehouse that was built in the late 1800s and the parking lot. You can see a tiny bit of the chapel back here. There was another loft building over here. All right, speaking of loft buildings, as commerce developed, there was a need for manufacturing. A lot of the area went from being a very elegant neighborhood to being a bit gritty. Factories were then built, and that's when the cast iron buildings started to crop up in the neighborhood and allowed for 10, 12-story buildings to be built. Again, that was also part of what happened with the Industrial Revolution, was the introduction of steel. And that had a big effect on all of the building in New York City, as well as Chicago and anywhere else you see skyscrapers in this country. But it allowed for the cast iron, which created these facades and factories. So the evolution of these factories as commerce grew, and it, like everything else, went through its own evolution, where a lot of it moved out of the city, or it died. And that afforded space for artists. Very quietly, they moved into these factory spaces. This is the south side of Great Jones Street. And you can see here, again, I used some artistic license to build some of these structures. This is the building which housed, it was like a rooming house. And it was eventually broken through. If you see this opening here, where they cut through this structure to put in the subway. The corner structure here housed a family called the Russells, very wealthy family, and Broadway is here. Their stable was here. This is probably number 5 and 3 Great Jones Street. And number 7, which is my building, is right here. So you can see this remained or probably was restored several times over. And this, of course, is a relatively new building compared to the Russell home. Another bank existed here on the ground floor.
Joan, we're having a hard time hearing you. I think you need to put the other earpiece in. Yeah, thank you.
I'm so sorry.
It was just for a moment. There we
Good.
go.
Thank you.
Now we can hear you perfectly clear.
Okay. So the structure here, which was a garage, mechanics, is now been replaced by a rental condo. I'm not even sure. I think it's a rental building. This was broken through. Many of these buildings are your cast iron buildings. And again, artists lived in most of these structures up until the time of the 70s, 80s. And we'll talk about that in a second. Let's see what we got here. This is really what that block looked like. This was the Russell House, and this was the Homes. Hone was the mayor of New York at one time, and Philip Hone wrote a book of diaries about the neighborhood, about his political career, and also, of course, about all of the social activities that took place. So this is really my interpretation of what this block looked like, again, based on the deeds and my reconstruction based on drawings. This structure here is where my building now lives. You can see it right here. This is the corner building on Broadway and Great Jones Street, and this housed a bank. And there was a bank in this building. So we have, again, based on the degree of commerce, the need for banks. I'm going to go back for a moment. There was a stable back in here in this structure, right behind that tree. And there were private residences on Broadway at this time. As I mentioned earlier, as commerce developed and there was that evolution from commerce moving out of the city, the artists moved in and took over a lot of those spaces. This is actually an image, a photograph from the 1880s of this building here. I could get a better sense when I see these photographs. You can see the orphanage back here. The Schimmerhorn building is here. So by examining so many of the drawings and whatever photographs I could find, I could get a sense of what was and may in some cases be today. This was a photo of the raising of that building opening up Lafayette Street for the subway. Um, these were rooming houses. A lot of the old buildings turned into rooming houses to house workers. So the neighborhood had become rather, as I said, a bit gritty in the late 1800s. People were living here to service the factories and the construction that was going on. This is the actual opening of Lafayette Street. The Schrimmelhorn building is back here. This is what was 9 Great Jones Street, or is 9 Great Jones Street. I believe, based on my research, this building fell as a result of the construction, as much as they tried to protect it. That's my own surmise, because it became a parking lot and a gas station, this whole plot of land. This is Bond Street over here. Let me just go back for a moment, please. As we look at the loft buildings, artists have lived in those for some 20, 30, 40 years. And some of the people who lived on Great Jones Street were living in a very quiet, obscure block. Great Jones ran from Broadway to the Bowery, so it was rather short, but very sweet. You had people like Charlie Mingus living at number 5 Great Jones. Nat Jones, pianist, lived at number 9 Great Jones. He lived there until probably the late 90s. Kurt Lightsey, another pianist, jazz pianist. John Vaccaro lived in number 9 Great Jones. He was the director and the initiator of the Theater of the Ridiculous. The 70s was very big for avant-garde art, music, theater, and housed a lot of the people who were involved in the production of theater and music of the time, as well as the painting and other fine arts. Rauschenberg and his whole coterie of people, which I will not go into at the moment. You had, of course, Andy Warhol at the end of Great Jones Street on the Bowery, and his protege, Jean-Miguel Basquiat. Danny Christensen living across the street, who was one of the wonderful painters of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and 90s. As people became more aware of these spaces, they too evolved in the 80s, late 80s and 90s to today, where they became very elegant residences. There was at one point an article in the Village Voice, the cover of the Village Voice had a statement: if you want to develop a neighborhood, bring in the artists. Well, that was very true to the form, because so many of those lofts became very wealthy homes, and the artists had to migrate to Brooklyn, to the Bronx, to Queens, and further on. So it too has evolved. I just wanted to show you some of the thoughts, the designs for subway stations, or the tube, as it was called at one time. For some of you who never knew this, the trains were elevated before they became subterranean. This is Grace Church down here. This is actually Broadway. Another design for the subway, an elevation. I just fell in love with a lot of the drawings, and I couldn't help myself to include them in this presentation because some of the designs were just amazing. This is the Lafayette Street after the subway was built, and putting the cobblestones in. We're looking north from Bleecker Street. And this is from 1934. Again, we have the Schmimmerhorn building here. The Silk building is back here. The gas station is here. And you can see where that building had fallen or had been raised right here, this whole plot of land. This is Bond Street. And that too has changed. It was very hard to keep this going, to keep it up to date, because there was so much new construction going on in the neighborhood in the last 20 years. So I had to say circa as a way of describing the time period. This was the first actual cast iron building. And I just wanted to put that in to give you a sense of what that was looking like. And this was built in 1851. So the evolution of NoHo has gone through a definite change. It went from being a very horizontal, elegant, wealthy neighborhood. It's now become a very vertical, wealthy neighborhood. And with that, I would like to say thank you so much for attending. I do wish to thank the Village Historical Society for being so supportive of my book and for helping me do this presentation. In particular, Andrew Berman, who is the director and has been, I call him my rabbi, he doesn't know this, but he was very helpful in as the bird on my shoulder. Leanne Boley, who has been wonderful in helping me with so much of the presentation, in particular Zoom, as was Hugh Evans and Sam Moskowitz. And again, I thank you for coming to the presentation. I'm sorry it wasn't in person. I would have probably been a little bit more relaxed, but this is Zoom days. And I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, I think now is the time. Thank you again.
Thank you, Joan. That was lovely. And thank you for the thanks. We're getting a lot of very beautiful comments in the chat. Many people saying such a treat, you know, what a gift to see your illustrations. I fully agree. We do have a couple questions that I will lob your way. If anyone has any additional ones, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A pane. So the first question is, what is the name of the museum on 4th Street with the beautiful interiors?
It's called the Merchant Museum.
And they're our co-sponsor for tonight. So thank you for that. We didn't pay anyone to ask that question. It was a legitimate question. And then we had another question. Is it known if the Great Jones Alley extended up into this block? And I'm not sure, Eric, if you're still on, which block we were talking about. Maybe Joan, you know which block they may be talking about.
Great Jones Alley ran from Great Jones Street across to Bond Street. It was also called Shinbone Alley in its earlier days.
That's fascinating. And then Dale asks, you are showing a great number of street trees. Is that accurate for the second quarter of the 19th century? So is that one of those artistic license things, Joan, or do we know?
That was artistic license, trying to bring a little green into the storyline. No, of course, with so many of things being raised, it's hard to tell what actually could have been there. As they tore down, I watched, I didn't really watch, but the Bowery Bar, for instance, had been a gas station before it became a restaurant. And it had two or three beautiful old trees. And I believe they were destroyed. I'm not sure, but they're not there anymore. They're making room for this new monster that's going in.
And how were the former stables used? Do we have any information on that? Someone asked that question.
The stables were actually, they housed the horses and carriages, because all of these mansions, not only they needed the horse and carriage, the cars had not been invented yet. And so they housed not only the animals and the carriages, but I probably would imagine the grooms.
And then someone asked, what was the fire issue that you mentioned? What was, let's see, you mentioned fire insurance. What was the major issue?
Well, I believe, and I really must say I'm not completely smart about this, but the fires were rather common because so many structures initially were made of wood. But insurance companies did not really develop until the mid 1800s, where the concept of insurance came about. And so in order to give these policies, they needed to know who was living where. So that's when these maps became far more detailed and were more carefully drawn because of these insurance companies.
Great. I think that might be all of our questions. Thank you for the Merchants House Museum for co-sponsoring this. That was really great. Oh, here's one more question. This is a great one to end on. Will you continue your research and documentation of the changes in the neighborhood?
Probably not. I don't think so. I think I'm going to get back to my painting, which I had put aside to do this book and to market it.
Well, I think it's such a gift to be able to see your drawings, your elevations, and then of course juxtaposed with these incredible photos that you found. Just really wonderful. And the person who asked was said, "Oh no, I think they really enjoyed your research, Joan, and your book." So we will follow up tomorrow, everyone, with an email with how you can contact Joan for her book. You can always also reach out to us and we'll connect you. We'll also include some links. Speaking of the fire issue, there was just a great blog my colleague Sarah wrote on fires in the village. But lots of gratitude from the chat, Joan, for you. I will share that with you tomorrow. This has been recorded and we will share that with you all again. And that's it. Any last thoughts, Joan, you'd like to share before we sign out. When I hit end, we all go away immediately. So it's kind of abrupt.
I just want to thank everybody for being there and for your questions. So it was a wonderful experience building this book and the research, because it opened up so many different venues for me to find some of the most amazing drawings, and the deeds themselves were fascinating.
Great. Well, Joan, this was thrilling and just very lovely. So thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you for doing your book. And thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you at our next event. There's a full slate in May to check out, including walking tours. We have something special with the Blue Note. So check out our website. And Joan, thank you again.
Thank you, Leanne.
Have a great evening, everyone. Take care.